What's that? Okay. Hello and welcome everyone to this month's edition of the Milwaukee Sitecore Developers Meetup. This month we're kind of taking a step back and trying to get some new folks in by doing more of a back to basics introduction to Sitecore for .NET developers, presented by Dysart. Derek's been doing Sitecore work for 6 years now. Cow. And is a local kind of freelance Sitecore developer and architect. What's that? Oh, thank you. I want to thank Mike Congdon LLC for the Tall Boys. Thank Hanson Dodge for hosting and for the pizza, and our other sponsors as well who will help us in other months, Active Commerce and Accentium. Next month, we are planning a recap of the Sitecore user group, the SubCon Sitecore user group conference, which is later this month. Anyone going to the SubCon in New Orleans? If you are interested in Sitecore and you've done a little Sitecore work, you might look into it, subcon.com, I believe. Sponsored in part by former Hanson Dodge employee Mike Reynolds. Should be a good time, but for those of you not going next month, we're going to basically do a recap of the presentations there, and that's likely going to be at SafeNet, which is right down the street on Erie. Other housekeeping stuff, if you're parked in the lot out here, you're good. Bathrooms over here on the left, and there's plenty of beer and pizza, so help us finish it off. So again, Derek Dysart. Thanks, Derek.
Thanks, Nick. So yeah, we kind of kicked it around. We wanted to do kind of a back to basics for Sitecore. We've kind of covered some really deep dive topics. Nick, when Sitecore launched the new experience database and the Mongo backend for that, Nick kind of did a deep dive on that. We had, as Nick mentioned, Mike Reynolds. He gave a presentation on Sitecore PowerShell and just kind of the stuff you can do with that. This is really geared towards, if you're a .NET developer, where you get started with Sitecore. Because it can be daunting if you are used to writing normal ASP.NET applications, or if you're coming from another content management system like WordPress or Drupal. Nomenclature can be confusing with Sitecore. As well as just kind of where do you get started, or how do things work. So as Nick mentioned, I'm Derek Dysart. I'm a freelance developer in the Milwaukee area here. I specialize in Sitecore, so I do mainly Sitecore development and architecture. I've been doing this for about 6 years, probably about 20 websites under my belt on Sitecore. So it's something I'm quite passionate about. As a .NET developer, it's just a really great platform to work on. The framework is is really easy to use from a developer standpoint. So I guess the big question is, before we can get started, what is Sitecore? And if you've been to many presentations, this is a great marketing slide. It's a bunch of boxes with layers. Seems like all software is boxes with layers. And actually, as you get to know Sitecore, this is probably a good one to come back to. But it is an advanced system. Most people think of it as a content management system, but it doesn't have a whole digital marketing component. It can take analytics, personalize the website based on those analytics. It can you can do A/B testing quite easily as long as you develop the site correctly. But I would say 80%, especially if you're kind of a web developer, 80% of what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to get data out of SQL Server into a content management system out to a website. So that's all kind of nice about what really is Sitecore. We'll kind of dive a little bit deeper. Here's some more layers. But as we get to look at this, Sitecore's got an application layer where a lot of the application lives. And these layers are actually, they're not just kind of metaphysical layers within the software. The entire data access that you do is done through a layer. You don't, as we'll kind of get to, Sitecore is back-ended by a SQL Server database. You don't write any SQL in order to do data access in Sitecore. So we asked the question, no, really, what is Sitecore? So in its purest essence, it is an ASP.NET application. This is and I'm not putting this up here. Basically, if you look, it plugs itself in as a HTTP module in the system.web server portion of web config. So when you install Sitecore, it drops a massive web config into your web root and probably 200 megs of files that's supported. So these are all of its various assemblies, all of the assets to run the authoring system. So images, CSS, JavaScript. It also has all of the the necessary .NET code to run the authoring and delivery side of it. So it plugs in. I go to the next slide. This is kind of the older style where you would plug in an HTTP module in web config, and there's really just a handful of web config or HTTP modules that it runs. The most particular one that does most of the work is the second one listed. It's the nexus.web.http request or HTTP module. And if you go into Sitecore and crack open any of the assemblies, you can plow through them with Reflector quite easily and actually see kind of how it works, except for the Nexus module. It's the only obfuscated assembly in the entire install. And it's kind of Sitecore's special sauce. I think they hide a lot of their proprietary logic is in there, but the bulk of it is the requests coming through that. So unlike a normal IIS site, Sitecore handles all the traffic coming to that site. So if you think back to the IIS 6 timeframe, you would create an ASP.NET application, and all the requests to ASPX pages would go through ASP.NET. But if there was on your page a link out to say a style sheet, that's just a static file that IIS is going to serve over. And if a static file, that request will actually go through Sitecore, and Sitecore will look to see, is there an actual static file of that? It will return that. But all of the image requests and all that, as we'll get into, is handled by Sitecore. And that's done through this HTTP module. The other thing you'll find in the web config is there's a config section handler for a Sitecore configuration section in web config. And if you dig through that web config, you'll see that's taking the lion's share of all the of that entire web config. So Sitecore's got a very extensive configuration system that we'll kind of get into, but that's another kind of important part of it. But at the end of the day, it is a directory on IIS being served on IIS running ASP.NET, and then the back end is just SQL Server. So if we look at SQL Server, there is 3 main databases that it installs. There's a master database where you do most of your web authoring. So that's where you edit pages, and as you edit those pages, the changes are versioned in that database. And then if you create other versions of that, say you have an English version of a page, and a French version of this page, and an Arabic version of that page, that's all stored in master. And all versions live in master. And then there's a process in which you publish from master to web. And that process looks, it scans all the data in master. It takes the most recent version of an item. We'll get to what an item is later. And pushes that into the web database. And the web database is what serves content out to your site visitors. So authoring is done in master, content delivery, or authoring, or in parlance of Sitecore, content management, is done in master, and then content delivery, the actual delivery of web pages, if you're building a website, is done in the web database. And then core is another database that follows a similar structure to master and web. And core is where Sitecore stores a lot of its own configuration in order to run itself. So a lot of the configuration of the authoring environment itself is served out of core. The configuration of it there can be changed. So that those are the 3 main databases. I'm leaving out of here, there's an analytics database, and depending on the version of Sitecore you're running, that the analytics get written to, in Sitecore 8 and 7.5, they get written to a MongoDB database. In Sitecore 7.2 and earlier, it's written to a SQL Server database. So there'll just be an analytics database there. your analytics are being written to MongoDB, there is also a process that will roll up those analytics into reporting, and that reporting database lives in SQL Server as well. At its base, though, Sitecore has this concept of it uses hierarchical storage. And so you can imagine that the easiest way to think of this is a website. You may have 4 main pages, the 4th page has 3 children. So this is kind of a typical sitemap structure you're used to, but this doesn't apply to just pages, this is just your content. So or think of it as almost like a database where every item has a parent, and it may have children. So if we look at one of these items, every item in fact has an ID. It has a globally unique ID, it's a GUID. It has a template that defines what is this item, and that template defines what fields are on there, and then it has several fields. So this item, this example I have here, there's a title field, there's an image field, there's a links field, and a field called copy. Additionally, you may have different versions of this item. So in this case, we may have 3 versions of this item. These represent revisions. There can be workflow tied to these. So one, say version 2 is approved for publishing, yet version 3 is still being authored. Sitecore allows for that. And not only can you have different versions, but you can have versions per language. So in this case, we may have 2 versions of this particular item in French. If you dig into Sitecore, or if you dig into Sitecore's SQL databases, there is a physical table structure. As I said, I've worked on about 20 sites over 6 years. I can count on one time that I've actually had to dig in there. And it was a case where I had an item that somehow its parent was deleted, and Sitecore didn't correctly delete all of its children along with it. So I actually had to delete it out of there. And that is, in that time, that is the only time I've ever actually written SQL against a Sitecore database. Typically, you're not going to do that. You're going to use the data API to get at all of these items within Sitecore. So let's look at templates and fields. This is templates. We're all kind of used to templates. Templates are how websites look, but in Sitecore, templates aren't visual. Templates actually correspond more to a data type. So if you come from, for example, the WordPress world, templates are like the visual structure. I need to install a new template on WordPress because I want to change how it looks, or I want to change how it functions. So in the Sitecore world, templates define an item and what fields it's comprised of. And it allows for multiple inheritance. So what's really nice on this is, say we're building a site, we can create a template called content base. And we're going to add 4 fields on that: a title, the navigation title we're going to display in the navigation, and maybe a hero image for, every page on our site is going to have a hero image. Then we may also define another template that contains all of our SEO data, like the meta keywords, the description. You may put the page title in here. A lot of people kind of think that the page title may belong with that, and you can do that if you want. Neither of these really inherit from something, but where it gets interesting is now we're going to create a book detail page. And so this book detail page is going to have all the information that goes along with a book. So like the author, the ISBN, some marketing copy that goes with it. So when we look at what fields are available on a book detail page, we not only have the author, ISBN, and marketing copy, but we've inherited from those other 2 templates, and we get those fields as well. So you have a really nice model for building kind of an inheritance structure, not having to repeat the same. If you're using the same field on several different items within Sitecore, you can only have to define it once, and you can reuse that template over and over. So if we look at what fields are, there's the really simple ones you can think of, and hopefully this comes across. There are kind of the text fields, like single text, single line text, multi-line text. You have a rich text field, which allows you to store HTML and gives the content editor a nice kind of WYSIWYG rich text editor. You can have numbers or integers. You can have a drop-down with different values available for that drop-down. You can have a date or a date time or a checkbox. If we get a little bit more complex, you can store images. Images themselves end up getting stored as an item in in Sitecore. So when you upload an image via this tool, you say you can upload an image, you pick where it's stored in the content tree, and then it actually gets stored as an item in Sitecore. And by default, that image actually gets stored in SQL Server. It's not stored as a static file on the file system. It's actually stored in blob storage in SQL Server. So that when this image is requested, Sitecore will actually pull it out of SQL Server and serve the image as if it were a real file. And that's the same thing with the file field. Here we're defining a file that is stored within the media library and then served out that way. Some more complex, you can store links. This first one allows you, a general link allows you to link to other items in the Sitecore tree. It allows you to link to media items in the media library, or it allows you to just store a URL. And it's more than just the URL. It's the URL, what does the link text say? What is the target for it? So does this link open in a new browser window? And then there's a couple different list fields. You have a multi-list and a tree list, which these are fields if you need to store, instead of a drop-down where you only pick one item, you need to pick from a list of different items. So for instance, in this example, this could be a field on a product that says what colors is this product available in, and it comes in blue, red, and white. Under the covers, all these fields are stored as text. So if you actually look into it, if we look at where that is, this link field is actually stored as a pipe delimited list of GUIDs. So if we go back, we have blue, red, and white. Those represent items in the Sitecore tree. And behind the scenes, it's storing references to all those items as a pipe delimited list. Another thing to consider, since we showed you can have different versions of an item, is what's the field scope? By default, fields are versioned, meaning that for every version of an item you create in every language, there is a new value. By default, it will inherit the old value. So if you set a title on version 1 and the title is My Favorite Book, and you create version 2, it'll still be My Favorite Book until you change that value. An unversion means there's a unique value for each field. So a book title may have a title in English, and it may have a different title in French, but that title is fixed in time, never changes across versions. And then shared is something that's truly shared across all versions and languages. So in this case, we look back, we have different versions and different languages of these fields. So who can guess kind of how are these templates stored? What if I told you that they're stored as items? So templates are made out of items, just like Soylent Green is made out of people. And that nobody got it, only Bill got that reference. I know it's an old movie. But in the Sitecore tree, templates are just more items. Templates are actually defined by a template item. A template item has a template of template. A template field has a template of template field. So all of these, where this is really interesting is anytime you're working with Sitecore items, whether they're items that represent pages on your site, they're items that represent metadata values in terms of, like we looked at product colors, the products come in versions of red, white, and blue. Those are items. On down to templates, it's all accessed via the same API. So if we look at how we get at actual Sitecore items, in the first part, we usually don't have to do this. We're running in the context of a web request, and Sitecore will automatically find the database that we need. So if we're in an authoring environment, it will give us a reference to the master database. If we're in a content delivery environment, it will give us a reference to the web database. The first thing we need is a reference to the database. And then we need the ID. In this case, we're taking a string version of the GUID and parsing that into an actual ID. And then we call database.getID or getItem and pass it in the ID. Database also has an items collection with an indexer that will take that ID. That'll also return a reference to that same item in Sitecore. You can also get to it via the path. So just like we have a file system, and you would access a file via a very defined path of c:/temp/file/my file. You can have, Sitecore has a path system in its hierarchical storage of site, you could be looking in this case, we're Sitecore content website home. And so we pass that path into get item and we get a reference to that item. Other things we can do once we have that item, or we can, with that, we can also request a very specific language version of that item. So in this case, we're going to take our ID and get the German version of it, or we're going to actually get, in this last example, we're going to get the second version of the German language of this item. Other things we can do is Sitecore's got a query language for actually finding these items. It's loosely based on XPath, and so we can actually use the data, our reference to the database, and issue a query to get the item. So in this case, we're going to do a query for all the items that are underneath Sitecore/content/website/home. This will return a reference to all of the items there. With that, you can use XPath syntax to say, not only do I want that, but I want ones where the field template key, which is a built-in field, is book. So what this does, where template key here in this case, we're going to get all the items that are of the template book that are underneath the home item. With that, template key is a built-in one. That's why it's got kind of the double @ sign in front of it. But we can actually say, give me all the books that have a field called it's good that's equal to 1. Or all the books that have a price that's less than 10. So there's a bit of context you can do with this. You can use it to get at many items. You can dynamically build these strings. A couple things to keep in mind is that you can do kind of bad things with this. So if you put a double slash and a star at the end of it, that says, give me all of the descendants of this item. So if you're really high up in the tree and you have tons of pages in your site, it's going to walk through every single page on the site and return that to you. And if it's thousands and thousands of them, it's going to take a long time to run. Conversely, if you do that and then specify another constraint on there that says, give me all the items underneath this node, all descendants that have a template key of book, that's going to take a while, because under the covers, Sitecore is actually going to walk every node of the tree testing your query. This might be a little bit small. Let me see. So once we have an item, what can we do with it? So we've gotten an item back from the database. In this case, we can find its ID. It's got a property called ID. It's got a property called name. It's got a collection of languages that are in it. It's got a language property, and we can get the name of the language. It's got a version property. We can get the number of the version. We can also get at what languages are there or what versions of it. We can also look at what template is this item based off of. So maybe we've had some other API that's given us an API, some other API that's given us an item. We can inspect that and actually see what the template is. It's got a collection called children. These are all of the child items that are underneath it in the tree. And then we can do things like create new items. So in order to do this, typically you're running in a context where you may not have write access. So you can invoke what's called a security disabler. We put that in a using block, so we dispose of it when we're done. We need an item, if you remember back, it consists of a template. So we get a reference to the template that we need, and then we actually say, let's create a child item, so item.add, we give it a title, and we tell it the template, and it'll create a new item in the tree. So once we have an item really the important thing we're going to need is fields. So we want to get at the fields on this. If we're rendering out a web page and we've got our title tag and our markup, we need to actually get at the title. So that's where this first part comes into. Here we say item. It's got an indexer that takes a string, and we get the field name. A lot of mistakes that I see is that people would use. They'll be in Visual Studio, they say item dot, and they say, oh, there's a fields property. I need the fields. And then that gives you a field and you get the value back. So you run your code. If that field doesn't exist, it doesn't return a value. And then when you do dot value on that, it's going to throw in no reference. So you got to be careful about that. Anybody remembers the Connell book, Coding Horror, that Jeff Atwood stole his website logo from? That's, you really want to kind of avoid, if you can. It's a common mistake I see, but you want to avoid using dot value to get at the string value of a field. And then Sitecore's got several other field definitions that you can cast to. And under the covers, there's an implicit operator that is converting from the field to this type. So if you have a checkbox, the checkbox class has a dot checked value. It's a Boolean, which would make a lot of sense if you have a Boolean field like a checkbox. Under the covers, Sitecore stores that as a 1 or a 0. Same thing with the multi-list field. You can actually call get items and it'll give you a reference. If you take a multi-list field and actually just get the string value, you're going to get that pipe delimited list of IDs, or you can use a multi-list field, cast it to that object, and actually get a collection of the items back. So I kind of mentioned search can be slow, especially as your item tree gets large. So Sitecore's approached that with implementing indexing behind the scenes. So prior to version 7, it was Lucene only. So if you have the luck to be working on a version 6 site, you're kind of stuck using Lucene. Sitecore 7 and later, including Sitecore 8, which is the current version, went to a search provider model. So if we look at how that works, Sitecore out of the box will provide and the default install still uses Lucene, but all of the search is done through an API that completely removes the details of Lucene. And we'll look at some code that you actually write a link query to get at your items within Sitecore, and then the data provider itself actually parses that query into a native Lucene query, executes the query, and then returns you objects of that type. But these providers also then provide the ability to crawl the database. So Sitecore obviously stores things as items. Lucene doesn't store things as items. So it does the field translation in order to know, how do I store a multi-list field? How do I store an image field? What do I store that as in Lucene? So that's part of the provider. Same thing with Solar. As I mentioned, Sitecore provides Lucene and Solar. There are third parties that provide other providers. We had a couple months ago, we had Coveo Enterprise Search in to do a presentation. They provide a search provider that plugs into the same model. You can write your code, you run it against Lucene, decide you need something with a little bit more horsepower, and actually you take advantage of Coveo. Your front end code doesn't need to change. When I say front end code, the code that's driving your front end, not the HTML, but you can still use the same functionality there. So how does this work? Again, it's quite simple. Simple-ish, I should say. If it's new to you, it's not that simple. But it's not a lot of lines of code. Here we have an access to an item, and from that item, we're going to get basically which search index does this item live in. So that's where we get the search index. Using that search index, we create a search context, and the context has this function called getQueryable. You pass it a type, and by default, the main type that Sitecore uses and provides is the search result item. And then you write a link query. So in this case, we're going to say where the search result item has a field called binding that equals paperback, and an author field that equals king. And then we're going to continue on and say we want to order that by the publish date, and then we're only going to take the first 5 of those. So it's just a standard kind of link query. We're going to get the results back. Under normal circumstances, if you're used to working with linked objects, when you call toList, it actually executes your query, and it does the equivalent of like a for each and doing all your testing. When you do a toList here, it actually triggers the search provider to take that link expression, parse it into this crazy expression tree, build what should be your Lucene query or your Coveo query or your Solar query, execute it. And then that provider not only does that, then takes all the results and maps them back to these search items. So now at that point, we've got a collection of those items. Here I'm going to just transform them into a list of strings. So in this case, I'm going to return a list of titles. So this is still a little kind of messy. We're still kind of loosely coupling here. We have binding. Binding is just a string we're providing. But we can tighten this up a little bit. So if we define just kind of a plain old C# object called book, it's got a binding string, it's got an author string, a date time field, a published date, and a string that's title. Now we can actually feed that in, and instead of requesting a search result item, in this case we're going to request a book object back, and we can actually use that book object in our link query. So that's great. That's all about data. I come from a database background, but I know a lot of people kind of come from the front end. So like, what about all the visual stuff of this? Like, where are the templates that I know and love? So we'll look at kind of how Sitecore handles what you would consider visual templates. And it does that via two items, called a layout and a rendering, and a third item called a device. So a device is kind of what is the end target that we're serving this request to? Is it a web browser? Is it print? Is it a mobile device? It allows you to do some detection to figure out what is the end target we're doing, and then allow you to select, okay, what layout do I want? And if you think in the ASP.NET world, layouts are very similar to ASP.NET master pages. So this is kind of the boilerplate that every single page is on. Typically, your layout's going to contain your opening HTML tag. It may have part of your head tag. It's going to have a closing HTML tag. And then Sitecore has this concept of placeholders. So in this diagram, I've labeled PH content as a placeholder where I want to put my content. So if you imagine stuff that's outside of that is just kind of boilerplate HTML, my doc type, open HTML. So in this case, I'm going to put a rendering in there called header. And if we look over on the side, this is actually a screenshot from where you configure these renderings. In this case, I put a rendering called header into the PH content placeholder. So then maybe I add another rendering called main body. And actually that rendering itself has placeholders. There's a PH left and a PH right. Because my design, I have a left column with a right rail that's going to have some content. But that's another rendering we've added. Maybe in the left side, I have a lead image and the article. Those are put into the PH content / PH left, so it tells it which placeholder to put it into. And then maybe in the right rail, we have an author bio and a related pages component that's going to show pages that are related to this current page. The thing to keep in mind, this is completely data-driven. And I have some example code and an example site we'll look through. But when you define these renderings, you actually have to define them as data, as items in Sitecore. So I have a rendering called header. And part of the data that's on that is like where does Sitecore get header? So what are these renderings actually are? You could have what's known as a sub-layout rendering, which is just a user control. It's a .ascx file. And you may just have a snippet of code in there. That this one's got an opening div. Sitecore provides you some server-side controls. They all have an SC prefix. So in this case, we have an image. And one of the attributes is what field does this image pull from? And then some text. What field does this text pull from? That's all that this sub-layout does. So maybe we have a header that the header's got an image and it's text on it. And so in Sitecore, we define that header sub-layout as it is rendered from this ASCX file that lives on the file system somewhere. Not used as much. It's kind of a heritage of Sitecore. Sitecore used to be almost completely based on XSL renderings, but if you're a big fan of XSL, you can write renderings in XSL. Again, you have user controls that allow you to output a title or some text. If you want, you can actually write a web control, basically inherit from the Sitecore web UI web control, and then override the do render. And then starting in Sitecore 6.6, and actually it's becoming kind of the preferred method, you can actually use MVC. So you can actually have a rendering based on an MVC view, or you can have a rendering actually based on a controller action. So that's a little bit about kind of the rendering engine. How do you actually piece these together? So you have at your base, you have a layout that kind of defines your boilerplate markup, if you will, including, there you're going to have links to where is your CSS live, where is your JavaScript live, what do I need to load jQuery? Do I have a lot of do I need to load any other JavaScript libraries? And then you have all of the kind of the data that goes into the layout. And by default, we've really been kind of assuming all of these fields are coming off of an item in Sitecore that represents our page. So the home page has an item that has all these fields to fill out all of the information on this page. But in this case, I've got kind of a sample here. Here we've got a header with a body on the left and then a footer. And now we've got 3 items on the side that are promos. Maybe they're site promos for sales we're having, trying to drive whatever. Those could be the same user control repeated 3 times on there. So we put the same promo rendering into the rendering details, and Sitecore will output that code 3 times. But if we do that, how do we know how do we vary those? And we can actually, instead of pulling straight off the page, in this case, we have a Sitecore tree, we have a home page. Instead, these promos are going to actually pull from different content items in the tree. And in Sitecore, this is called a data source. And where this gets really cool is when you start getting into marketing. Say I want to, this promo, I'm going to render fields off of this promo 1 item, which says, we have free shipping. Well, what if somebody's coming from outside the US where we don't ship for free? It costs us a lot of money to ship internationally. So we use the analytics engine to do a GeoIP and create a rule that says if the person is in the US, we show this promo. Otherwise, we're going to hide it because we don't want to tell people from Canada or from Europe that we have free shipping when we really don't, and it's not relevant to them. And this is really where the power of Sitecore's data-driven rendering becomes really key. And this is a lot of why a lot of marketers buy this, because this demos amazingly well. You can say, you know what, I've been watching this guy I've stored all the content on my site, and this buyer's come in, they've hit all these pages. We put them into this persona, and now you can actually start targeting content at that person. And the only way you can do that is by varying the data source, or even varying which renderings are put into a placeholder. And all that is completely data-driven. And in order to do that, you have to use data sources. As I mentioned, devices are just kind of alternate rendering outputs that you can use by default. This is I took this screen grab off of a default install of Sitecore 8. There's a default is typically your web pages, and then you have print and mobile. This is if you're going to use adaptive layout. If you're doing truly kind of I'm drawing a blank. It starts with an R. Responsive, yes. Responsive layout, typically you're going to have, that's just going to be a single website out there. But if you have content that maybe you don't want to output to the web, or you have a very different print version of your website, you can specify alternate layouts that way. So that's just kind of a base of how you get into building a website. But a lot of times, as developers, we're not necessarily just like take this HTML and put it into a CMS and your day is done. You end up having to customize, or Sitecore doesn't do exactly what you need it to do. So what are kind of the extension and integration points? The biggest one Sitecore has is this concept of pipelines. So pipelines are basically a sequential set of steps that accomplish some goal. And some common ones that happen almost everything in Sitecore happens because of the pipeline. So when Sitecore starts up, it runs the initialize pipeline. When it goes to actually render a field, that user control you saw where we're going to take a text and actually render it out as some HTML, that goes through a render field pipeline. When Sitecore goes through and actually picks which layouts are going to be used to generate the markup, that goes through the render layout pipeline. A common one is the HTTP request begin. This pipeline runs on every single request that comes in. So say you have, I have some example on that. If we look at the request begin pipeline, here we have several different processors, and these run in a sequential order. And I have some sample code of what one of these looks like. So in this case, we're extending the HTTP request pipeline. So we derive from the HTTP request processor. The pattern on all of these pipeline components is you inherit from a class, and then you override the process method. So if we go back to, yeah, I know I did it. If we go back to this, it's going to run each one of these steps. It's basically Sitecore is going to, and if you look, these are specified given a type and an assembly. So most of these are coming from the Sitecore kernel. It's going to basically instantiate one of those components and call the process method. And then you're passed in a set of arguments that it basically traverse the entire pipeline. So pipeline component gets a set of arguments, and then it does its work, and then the next one gets that argument. So you're kind of tweaking things on that argument structure. So in this case, say we have a case where we need to silently log in a user. This is actually from some code that runs in the authoring environment. So in order to get into the authoring environment, you have to log in. But we needed a case where we needed to silently log in that user behind the scenes. So in this case, we look at the request args, and the first thing we're going to do is pull two query strings values out of the request. So the argument passed into this, we can use the context and get at the request, pull the query string values for user and token out. So token was generated elsewhere. We check to make sure we actually have values for those, and then we actually look, this user.fromName actually calls into Sitecore's user data store to see does this user actually exist. So if we get a user back, then the final thing we do to see is is this token valid? And that's implemented in some other code. If that's the case, we log the user in, and here what we're doing, we're calling authentication manager login. Otherwise, we log in, we call the logging function. We say that we've got a bad token, and then we return at that point, and then the next start of the pipeline goes. So what we do is actually plug that into the pipeline, and what you could do is you could just go into web config, find that HTTP begin request section of the XML and edit it, and just insert your line in there. So you can insert your component into the pipeline, and you can get instantiated. The challenge, what you should really try and not do is edit the web config. That whole Sitecore configuration, Sitecore's got this concept of config file patching. So in this case, I write a very simple XML file with a .config extension and put it in this app config include in your web root. So when it boots up, it actually will read all the config files in there and use the patching instructions in there to patch it into that config structure. So in this case, we're patching into the pipeline. We're going to HTTP begin request, and then we're passing our processor. In this case, is whatever namespace our silent user login was in, whatever assembly, and then we give it an instruction to say patch it after wherever you see the type start measuring. And the other interesting thing here is if we go back to the code, we had a public property on here as a time span called maximum age. We can specify that in the config, by making it a sub-element of our processor. So when Sitecore instantiates our component, it will actually take all those sub-items, set those any public property on that to the value that was there. So now we can actually affect how that pipeline processor works and actually pass in parameters. Some gotchas with pipelines. You really need to be aware of where your pipeline runs. As I mentioned, HTTP begin request runs for every single request that comes into the site. So if you're doing something in your pipeline component that takes a really long time, you're gonna cause the entire responsiveness of the site to go down. Say you're doing something and you're checking a value, you're doing a database lookup to somewhere else, to an external database to make sure is this user actually authorized to do this. That's going to slow down your site. If you look at the code, we look to see did we actually get a query string value. If we didn't get the conditions that we were expecting, we got out of the way as fast as possible because you don't want to block the processing of the pipeline. The other one that's a common one is the save UI. And Save UI is a great place if you're trying to extend the authoring environment. Save UI runs anytime you click the save button in the authoring environment. And it's the only place you can get access to the item as it's being saved and validated against the original item. So if you want to check something and do a validation before you actually save the item, this pipeline gets run. But the challenge is it does block the UI thread. So it's when you hit save, behind the scenes, the editor issues an AJAX call and waits for the result to come back. And this save UI pipeline runs, it's going to block that AJAX call. And so if you're doing something where you're cranking through the tree, you're trying to reset a whole bunch of stuff in there, you're doing a lot of operations that save UI, the site's going to be unresponsive to the content author. The other one is events. Events are just raised in relation to things happening in Sitecore. The biggest ones are all of the item CRUD events. So every time you create an item or you rename an item or the item is saved or it's been deleted, those events get raised. There's another one for that publish operation I talked about. When publishing ends, you can get access to, you can be notified that, hey, publishing just ended. In this case, this is an example of the item added. And this is a little bit different than a pipeline in that it's more like an event delegate you might be used to if you've done that sort of development. Here you have a method that's going to get an object to add some event args. You can do some work with that, and then basically go about your business. These are patched in a little bit differently. They go in the events. You associate it with the event name that you're looking for. And in this case, instead of having a single method that's going to get called, you have to give it what method to call when this event occurs. So some advanced maneuvers are things I like to say, don't attempt unless you make lesson. Sitecore uses a provider model behind the scenes to do a lot of its work. As I mentioned, the entire data access is done. There's a data API that then calls into the data provider to get at SQL. If you're really adventurous, you can write a data provider that says, don't store this stuff in SQL, store it in Mongo. Mongo's great at storing hierarchical storage. Just let's not store everything in SQL Server, let's store it in Mongo. Or say you have data from an external system that you want to expose as Sitecore data within the content tree. So you can write a simple data provider that goes out and gets that information for a section of the tree so that to the end content user, it looks like you're just looking at content. And that content might not necessarily be stored in SQL Server. It could be stored in a product information system that details all your products or some other system. Same thing with search provider. Coveo is a classic example of it. They had a search product. They actually had a Sitecore connector for it. And then when kind of the Sitecore search was completely revamped to have a provider model, they actually wrote their own search provider to allow you to do Coveo searches from within Sitecore. The other interesting one, that there's a project out there, is standard values. So I kind of didn't touch on this when we were looking at templates, but standard values are what, think of it as field defaults. So when you create a template, you can create a standard value for it. It'll be an item underneath your template that's named __ standard values. And it will be of type of the template you just created. And in there, you can actually define the defaults for your field. So say we always want authors to start out with fields that's called title. So it kind of gives them an example of where to do that. Well, behind the scenes, Sitecore actually figures out what the value of a field is. If it's blank, it will actually go and look in that standard values item to see. So they haven't edited this field. Maybe they just want the default value for this field. So that it calls into the standard values provider to go look at the standard values. You can plug into that and say, take it even further and say, if there's no value in here, go look at standard values. But say it's in a language, you haven't translated the French version of this field yet, so it goes and looks as the field's blank, it looks in the standard value. There's no value in the French version of the standard value. Go take the English value. Sitecore by default won't do that, but it allows you to take certain fields and have them fall back. And there's actually a Sitecore module out there called partial language fallback that does exactly this. And finally, let's kind of look at now where's our code going to live. I gave some props to AwareWeb. These diagrams are from them. But the kind of the minimum Sitecore architecture is you have a web server and SQL server. All your databases live in SQL server. You have authors that are authoring against that, and you have site visitors that come and browse your website. Kind of the next step up from there is let's separate authoring and delivery. And you have an authoring web server. Typically in Sitecore documentation, this will be referred to as the content management server, or CM. That has access to SQL Server, and then your content delivery server also has access to that SQL Server. So your site visitors hit your delivery server. If you got a really popular site, they're making that server, sweat. Meanwhile, your authors can do the work that they need to do. Or maybe you don't have that many authors, a really small authoring server and a really large delivery server. Or say you maybe need to load balance your delivery server. So in this case, you have a single authoring server. We don't have a lot of authors. They can author their content. It gets published to web. But we have a lot of traffic coming in. And we're going to put that behind a load balancer and then serve the content out through the load balancer. And finally, there's some really advanced scenarios where if you want to separate delivery from authoring to make sure you can put a firewall in between them. All the instances still need to share a version of the core database, so that's where you'll see the core database actually gets replicated out to a SQL server in your DMZ. This is where things start to get really tricky. I've heard reports where the replication gets a little difficult. So it's another kind of supported scenario. And that's kind of at a high level of what Sitecore is. The other thing I'd be remiss in talking about is the Sitecore developer community. It's actually a pretty strong community. As of Monday, when I made this slide, there's 3,600 questions on Stack Overflow tagged with Sitecore. I know several people, myself included, that subscribe to that tag. And if it's a simple question, I'll answer it all the time. And 9 times out of 10, when I look at it, I'm like, I know the answer to that. Somebody's already answered it. So it is a really, really good resource if you have questions. And like the rest of Stack Overflow, there's really no dumb questions as long as you've done if you can prove like, hey, I've tried this, I'm expecting it to do this, but I'm getting this. What am I, is there something I'm missing? Not like, hey, how do I do this? Which is, that goes with anything on Stack Overflow. Nick mentioned SubCon coming up at the end of the month. Registration is still open. It's kind of short notice to book travel all the way to New Orleans, but that's available. About every, and I guess it's not official, but about every 2 years, Sitecore does the Sitecore Symposium. So it was last year around this time, so the 2014 one was. The previous one was in 2012. The previous one before that was in 2010. So if the pattern holds, there's probably going to be one next year. We'll see. That's another one. Sitecore also just kind of revamped its own community, community.sitecore.net. I believe it's run intelligent in the back end. It's a really good community. There was a set of forums on the old Sitecore developer network that were really kind of kludgy, kind of hard to follow threads. You couldn't subscribe to things. The new community site's really good. Most of the brain trust of the Sitecore community does hang out there. And then recently, Mike Reynolds or Sitecore Junkie on Twitter, they created a public Slack channel. It's Sitecore Chat. Right now, they're kind of being a little bit guarded. They're not completely opening it up, but if you can say, hey, I'm interested in learning a little bit more about Sitecore, they've been more than generous with invites to that Slack channel. And then obviously you're here. We meet roughly a minimum quarterly, and I think for the rest of the year, we do have a pretty good schedule lined up. Come hang out. There are familiar faces here that I know. Everything I just said was completely not new to them. And I thank you guys for being quiet, not heckling me the whole time. But it's a great resource. There's a fairly strong Sitecore community in Milwaukee, and it's pretty close. And people from competing organizations. I mean, there's definitely people that Exentium and we've had Burndale in the past sponsor. We've had Hanson Dodge sponsor. They obviously sponsored today. It's less about like the organizations we work for and just more developers helping developers. So definitely don't be shy. Come on out. And with that, I do have kind of to save you from the presentation. And unfortunately, this is a really low resolution projector, but this is running locally. I have a Parallels version of Windows running, but this is a package that you can actually download once you install Sitecore called Launch Sitecore. And it's actually launchsitecore.com, although last night I noticed their site was down. But there's a package you can download, and there's instructions for installing it, and it's a fully baked out Sitecore site. And really the content of this site is all like, how do you go about evaluating Sitecore? This is great. This is great for marketers or somebody looking to buy Sitecore. But behind the scenes, you can actually log in. I hope this works. This is, yeah, I gotta log in again. This resolution's killing us. Wonder if I can unzoom.
Yeah, control minus.
So here we have, this is the Sitecore content editor. Probably gives you the best view. Actually, it's a little too small now, isn't it? The one thing they did in Sitecore 8 is they put a lot more white space in it, so this doesn't really do well on a low resolution monitor. But here we have this is the site that we were just looking at. Here's the home page. If we actually look on this presentation ribbon on top, if I look at the presentation details, this is all of the information or all the renderings that are defining that home page. So in this case, the layout, I don't think that's visible from the back, but there's a layout called Launch Sitecore Main. And that's the main layout that they're using. And then these are all the renderings that are on there. This first one goes in the main content placeholder, and it's a 1-4-1 layout. Really, all that's doing is just giving structure. There's placeholders in it. And if you look, for instance, this carousel control goes into the main content, into the row 1 placeholder. If we actually look at the values of that carousel control, we see it's got a data source that it's actually pulling the carousel slides from the default carousel location in Sitecore. So we look at where that is in the tree. And that was under, where are you? This global node, get rid of that.
can't tell the things they did in Sitecore because they look really bad on Sitecore.
Yeah. I mean, this would have looked, if this was Sitecore 7 or 6, it would look great. But everybody has really big monitors now, so they actually made it look really good on really big monitors. So now when you look at it on a small monitor, there's a lot more white space. So that's typically, you're not working in this cramped of space. But in this case, the default carousel has 3 of these. So if we actually look, when I mentioned you have to define these layout, these renderings, they're defined in this layout section of the tree, and these are just items as well. Here they're in the launch Sitecore folder under carousel. And we'll see, can I collapse the ribbon? Yeah, a little bit. So we look at some of the fields on this. This is if we look at the quick info, this is a renderings. This is a renderings controller. So it's a controller rendering. In this case, it's saying find the controller in this type, and you have to give it a type. So this is internally, there is a launch Sitecore controllers list controller, and that lives in the launch Sitecore assembly, and call the controller action carousel. Also, that ships with this. Wow, this is going to be. Let me close some of these windows here. Here's that controller action. In this case, they're doing some checks to make sure that the data source isn't null, and then they're just returning a view. You could do some other information. You could do some other actions in here first, and conditionally return a different view if you wanted to. So I was kind of hoping to dig a little bit more, but it's kind of painful to look at the code at this larger resolution. I would highly recommend downloading the launch Sitecore site. All of the code is provided with it. It's all installed via the normal package manager. So I'll show you at least in Sitecore 8. If you're used to Sitecore 7, it's different. They moved it. It's under, when you log into Sitecore, you're going to get this kind of what they're calling the launch pad. It's under control panel. And it's under this administration. You can install a package. So here you can upload it, and the package is just a zip file. And it's a zip file. If you ever crack it open, there's a very specific format in it that Sitecore uses to package all of its stuff. But you can install this. It'll lay down all the content for the site. It'll actually lay down the files in the web root and allow you to look at the controller actions. There's a bunch of view renderings in there as well. It's a really great resource. And for me, it was nice because I didn't have to come up with a demo site. Somebody's already done that. So it's a really good kind of demo site for Sitecore. The other interesting thing is this little tab over here allows you to, and it doesn't work on this small. If you're on a larger resolution, what this does is it gives you insight into all the marketing data that's being collected on you as you browse the site. So this site is actually using analytics. In this case, in the browsing I've done before, it doesn't kind of know what I'm doing. So it doesn't know where I fit. So like if I go look at some stuff that's very developer centric, so if I look at like building the site, what is presentation? So now I've looked at a couple, like how does the menu work? So now if I look at the pattern, it says, you know what, you're probably in the developer audience segment. And that's because some of that all this content's been pre-scored. And it says, you've looked at all this content, your score is highest for being a developer. If I was looking at like, what are the marketing capabilities and all that, it would probably say, hey, you're probably a digital marketer segment. So that it's a great site for kind of looking at a real world example of using these analytics. And actually, if I recall correctly, on the homepage, this carousel actually changes based on what marketing segment we think you're in. See if I can pull that up. So in this case, the data source is actually personalized. And these are rules. It's very similar. The rules are built in Sitecore, very similar if you've done rules in Outlook. But in this case, where the current visit matches the developer pattern, we're going to use the developer carousel. If the current visit matches the digital marketer pattern, we're going to use the digital marketer carousel. Otherwise, we're going to just default to the whatever set on the data source. So a lot of that, this is kind of a good tool for actually looking at Sitecore and seeing a concrete example of how to develop all these renderings, how to actually do a lot of this work. But even for a marketer, how do I set up a lot of this personalization and content scoring? And so with that, that's about all I have. I'll definitely answer any questions you guys have. Or it's just stunned silence from all the knowledge I dropped.
Oh, there we go. So I'm a freelance .NET developer. Let's say I want to start doing some Sitecore work. How do I go about that?
Yeah, you're kind of out of luck if you're a freelance developer. You need a license in order to install Sitecore. So if you are a customer that has Sitecore in place, typically you'll have developer licenses that will allow you to run a development instance of it. If you're a freelance person, it's kind of hard to get a hold of one of those licenses. So unfortunately, there's not a good story. And Sitecore is listening to this presentation later. Work with your freelance Sitecore developers.
Sitecore is listening to this presentation.
I know there's people out there listening. We are indeed broadcasting this on YouTube right now, and it will get watched. But yeah, in order to if you work for a Sitecore partner, for someone like Hanson Dodge or any of the other partners in town, Proficients, Layer Ones, Exentiums, most partners will have a partner license as well. So if you're working with a partner, or work at a partner, you should have access to be able to install Sitecore if you are a Sitecore partner.
So we talked about customizing pipelines and events in Sitecore. What if actually when it customized the user interface of Sitecore? Can you talk about that?
Yeah. So prior to so the question was, because I don't know if next questions come over. How can you customize the interface of Sitecore? Sitecore has its own kind of UI library. If you look, if we go back, it looks very much kind of Windowsy, even though it's kind of blown out. There's a start menu. Most of this is written in a technology called, I think this is still in Sheer UI, which is a kind of a XAML-based system for defining user interface elements. If we go back to the, let's see, nope. A lot of this user interface is written in a new technology called Speak. It is also a very data-driven user interface. You build this interface by building out items in the core database, and then having it call various JavaScript libraries that get at different information. So with the launch of Speak, Sitecore launched a JavaScript API to get at most of the information within Sitecore. Including items and marketing information. So you define out the user interface in here via adding items to the core database. All of them are used to define that. And if you're going to get serious about using Speak, there is a plugin for Visual Studio called Sitecore Rocks. It allows you to connect to Sitecore and browse Sitecore items from within Visual Studio, easily add and remove items. So you're not having to use the content editor for a developer. You have to do bulk operations on items. It's very easy to do via that. And building out the Speak interface in the core database, Sitecore Rocks has a lot of tools for doing that. And then basically you're calling JavaScript, your components then, your buttons that call JavaScript libraries in order to do that function.
I'd say even if you're not doing Speak, that Sitecore Rocks is still a great thing for developers.
Don't let me mislead you. Sitecore Rocks is a great tool that's free for dealing with Sitecore. And I guess that's probably another thing worth mentioning is if you notice, we're going to develop a website, we define all these templates that have various fields. Those are kind of developer artifacts. In a typical fashion, that may be your SQL Server schema. And so we define, if we're doing a kind of a traditional database-driven application, we may define all of our tables. Those tables have different rows, or I should say different columns. And it's always kind of been a challenge to how do we version control that? There's various methods for doing that. Redgate's got a really great product. But with Sitecore, we're not doing SQL Server tables. We've got templates in there. So there's a tool from Hedgehog, which is yet another Microsoft Sitecore partner based out of New York, called Team Development for Sitecore. Sitecore has a serialization format where any of these items can be serialized to the disk. There's a very specific format. This team development for Sitecore, or anybody that's kind of used Sitecore for a while, is TDS, will actually bring these in a specialized project inside of Visual Studio, and now you can version control those items. So as your first version of templates go out, and you do some enhancements, we had to add some fields, you pull those items, again, that comprise that template, you pull those into TDS, and now you commit that to your, whether you're using Git or TFS or SVN or something for your source control. Now you have the ability to source control all of the development artifacts that live as Sitecore data items. So that's a really useful tool. Even if you don't, the TDS makes that easy, but you can still, the serialization format, Sitecore writes those to a folder. It's underneath your data folder. You can get at those serialized files, and you can version control them yourself. But TDS makes that a lot easier. That is not a free product. It's about $900 a seat to get at, and it plugs into Visual Studio all the way back to Visual Studio 10. So Visual Studio 2010, 2012, 2013. I believe they support 2015 now. So that's another, if you're going to kind of get serious, or you work on a team that already has it, and all your Sitecore developers are saying, yeah, you have TDS installed, and you're like, what's TDS? That's what that is, and it's a great tool.
There's an open source alternative that I think is getting more and more popular called Unicorn.
Yeah.
And it has its own serialization framework called Rainbow. So
Unicorns and rainbows. So shout out to Cam.
Any other questions?
Yeah.
Regarding the infrastructure that you're supposed to set up with servers, and within the different servers, the different types of environments, CM servers. Do most companies, when they start a new Sitecore application, start from scratch? Do they use existing servers? And after the fact, what if you want to put other applications on the servers?
Sure. So the question is, if you're deploying Sitecore and you have, let me see if I can understand. You're deploying Sitecore and you have an existing infrastructure. Do companies use that? Do they deploy new infrastructure? And once you do that, can you run anything else on the Sitecore server? And so the question is kind of, it's a classic, it depends. But in essence, if we go back to what Sitecore is from a very technical standpoint, it's an ASP.NET application. When you install it, it installs as a site in IIS. So if you want to run other ASP.NET applications on that IIS server, you can. There's nothing preventing you from doing that. I've seen it where, and you'll see this a lot with a lot of Sitecore partners, where they're working on, say they're working on multiple projects at a time. And so they've got 5 different Sitecore sites under development, but they've only got so much server hardware. You can run multiple versions of Sitecore on the same server, because it's just an IIS site connecting to some SQL Server databases. So from a development standpoint, you can. It really comes down to kind of what is the traffic of the site going to be? Is it if it's a QA server or a development server, then it's not going to be a lot of traffic. It's just going to be your QA people, maybe some stakeholders looking at it. But if it's your production site, then you got to kind of look at what sort of traffic am I going to get to my site? Are you a kind of a small niche? I've worked on a site that was targeted at kind of financial advisors, and it's just kind of a learning site. It's all information for financial advisors to to do that. That would be a lot different than if it was American Express's main website. That's a consumer brand, they're gonna get a lot of traffic. So it really kind of depends on your traffic profile. If you're, I'm trying to think of like publicly known large Sitecore installs, but I know Microsoft uses it quite internally for a lot of internal websites. None that I know of that are very publicly known are coming to mind right now. What's that? Yeah, Procter & Gamble is another one. They're a huge site, huge. Kimberly-Clark's another one. They're running a lot of their brand sites on Sitecore. So if you look at kind of these large CPG brands, you look at like a General Mills, they have brands for all of their products. They're all going to be running, you know, they're going to be running probably large distributed systems. The other thing to keep in mind is that we've kind of demonstrated this is this is serving a single website. And typically what you would do in an old ASP.NET model is you would maybe create another, so you create an IS site, you set up bindings, so you have your host header bindings, so that this is going to serve example1.com. Now I'm going to create example2.com, you create another IS site. In Sitecore, those would run in the same IS site. Sitecore can serve multiple sites out of the same content tree, which gives you the ability to share templates across them. So if you're a large company, you have multiple sites maybe for each market that you're in, but you kind of share the same content across all those sites. Now you can actually leverage that template inheritance that says, you know, all of our products all have a serial number that conforms to this, you know, it's an octet of numbers or some weird thing like that. Now I've got a serial number field that I can reuse across all my product pages across all my markets. So Sitecore can serve multiple sites from a single install. So again, it kind of depends on the site and the traffic profile that you're looking at. If you're looking at a kind of a load balance site, yeah, it's gonna be you're gonna have a high traffic. But at the end of the day, it's an IaaS application running inside an app pool. So you can treat it like any other IaaS site. Any other questions?
We're noting on infrastructure too, Sitecore does have a module to run on Azure. What is it going to be providing retooling and licensing offerings around that?
Yeah, so as Nick pointed out, Sitecore does have an offering to run on Microsoft Azure. I've worked with customers that are doing that right now. It has its own challenges, but in the long term, it's pretty nice. And that you're able to leverage things in Azure like elastic scaling. So you can actually spin up new versions. Say you have a burst in traffic, or you know you're going to have a burst in traffic, you can spin up a bunch of instances, have them running, and then shut them down when you don't need them. Great. I appreciate you guys all coming out. Again, watch the website. I think our next one, as Nick mentioned, we're gonna do a recap of SubCon out of New Orleans. There's a number of us going, and come back and see what came out of that. And then I know we have a couple other speakers lined up for the end of the year. Nothing finalized yet, but we'll definitely have at least 2 more sessions through the end of the year. We'd love to see you guys come out. Thanks a lot.